the ultimate fantasy for me would be to go back in time. I have no interest in going forward and seeing what the future looks like, but to be able to go back and to actually be in those places and to be part of that for just a day, it's the ultimate fantasy for me. And as close as I can get to it is to paint pictures of them, of these scenes, as I can see through the photographs and from what I've heard from old-timers.
Let me tell you about 4th Avenue. 4th Avenue was this street that was the whole town. And it started out at one side of one street. And it had whatever there was there, the important things. You see, coming in that day, you came by steamboat, and your steamships left Seattle and stopped at all the communities on the way up. They brought in all the freight and all the food and all the mail and all the people, and they were the umbilical cord that kept Alaska alive, that steamship line. When you got to Anchorage, you had visited Juneau, Ketchikan, Petersburg, Wrangell, and many other places, depending on the season. And when you get here, you've seen all that, and here you find Anchorage is flat, not hanging on the side of a mountain. It had a straight, wide street. None of the other places had that. No other city in Alaska at that time had been laid out, and I don't think any has been yet since, laid out by the military on a planned basis, like a military program. Rectangular blocks, east and west streets were numbered, and north and south streets were lettered, just like a good old army post. The engineers surveyed the town site to make 50-foot lots, 150 feet long, with an alley. You know, that's a general pattern. There are exceptions, but that was the general layout. Then they designated certain blocks for public use, like one for the city hall, one for schools, one for cemetery, one for whatever. They were reserved, they were set up. And when you say Anchorage was planned, it's the closest any city ever had of a plan. The federal government sold lots at auction and started the town that way. When I got here, the 4th Avenue is lined both sides with 1- and 2-story buildings, mostly 1-story. Wood frame construction sometimes on nothing but wooden foundations. There's nothing permanent about the place. Nobody had capital. The struggle here was to get into business the best you can with what you've got. Actually, the town started in tents and moved up the hill, up in the bluff, when the engineers laid out the town site. The place developed then, and that took a lot of savings. It took a lot of borrowing and all that. That's the way Anchorage started. Nobody had any money. Nobody was here with any money to speak of. Young bucks, all with a gold background, attracted by the gold stampedes and the dream of finding gold.
Well, they were all looking for jobs, well-paying jobs, and when the gold rushes ran out, and then the next big thing was the next big project was the railroad. So it was like a big semicircle, this migration of young adventurers and people seeking their fortune, going this semicircle around to Dawson City, Fairbanks, Nome I did run, and then down in Anchorage. And many of these early families in Anchorage had done that, had gone that route.
And the ones that provided the steady employment were, in the early days, was the Alaska Railroad. And there was a few of the, I think, Alaska Road Commission and so on. If you worked there, you could get credit anywhere in town, and you could cash a check. And so most of the individuals who were young and getting married and everything seek those kind of jobs so that they would have some kind of security. And other than that, there were construction jobs that maybe were jobs in the fishing industry that only lasted a few months of the year and hardly provided enough to sustain any family throughout the winter.
There wasn't a whole lot there. There were stores on both sides of the street, but the street was, I would say, 2, maybe 3 blocks long.
There was one day, broad daylight. This had to be in the 20s. I'm sure, late 20s probably, where a moose came in from the east end of town and went right down 4th Avenue. And the people in these bars started, word got out there was a moose out in the street, and a lot of them carried guns. And they were out there trying to shoot that moose. And my dad says, I wonder if somebody wasn't killed because they were shooting right into each other practically from across the street. And nobody, and the moose went right out the west end of town, unscathed.
But the people that were here were the pioneer type of people, generally speaking. And they wanted things like where they had been. So they were willing to do the things that were necessary to make the place a better place to live.
They only had one boat a week coming to Alaska, and it came from Seattle, and destination Seward, bottom of the railroad. And the train would leave Anchorage with people that were going to take the boat out, and they would go down there and stay overnight in this old hotel in Seward that's still standing there. And then you'd get on the boat the next day, and they'd have all their names in the paper, all that was leaving, going down, and they'd have all the names of people coming in, what hotel they were going to stay at and everything. They had a path through the woods from the Anchorage Hotel down through the woods. They called it the Sugar Bowl at that time. But there was a winding trail down through the woods to the railroad station. That's the way people would go down there to meet the train. And the passengers would come up that way, too.
The boat train had come in on Friday, so towards evening, the locals would go down to the railroad depot and meet the boat train and anyone returning from the States. And then they'd run up the hill to the post office. By that time, the mail was being sorted out, and we sort of lined up against the wall in front of the mailboxes,
waiting for somebody to put the mail into your little box. And they frequently, it was a small population then, frequently they would say, oh, Aunt Nellie's going to go and see my mother. Everybody kind of knew everybody else's business. Everybody wanted to.
This was a close-knit town. We didn't have an adversary relationship. We were all here together, and we had a friendly feeling toward each other. We worked with each other, and we all wanted to improve the town, make it grow, so we get more amenities. We found every time we get an improvement, some kind, it meant we had better service.
They were eager for anything that was new, and I thought, this is ground level. It's right, I can start right at the bottom and work up.
The north side of 4th Avenue developed in a much better fashion than the south side, and that was, of course, because the sun shone on it. And especially in the winter, people did not like to walk in the shade. They still don't. So if you watch people walking 4th Avenue, the bulk of them will walk on the north side of the street where they're in the sun and the warmth.
Ike Bayless and Z.J. Lusac and Harry Seidenberg and Hewitt's Drugstore, all those stores were along that for 2 blocks. You got mainly 2 blocks of stores. And the town, was divided between east and west, really. The east side was down around C Street, 4th and C, where they had the major bars down there. And in the red light district, that was the so-called bad part of town, or what do you want to call it. And it was a pretty distinct dividing line. The men that wanted to drink and raise hell stayed down the east side, and they lived down there too. And they left the west side alone. There wasn't any bars or saloons on the west side. You could start at D Street all the way west. There wasn't a bar.
The big issue in the city council was where are we going to build the next wooden sidewalk? Because none of the streets were paved, none of them had anything, and they were all in the mud. And so the policy was to build sidewalks, give priority to the projects that would make a network of walkways to get to work. And everybody worked down the railroad yards. So it was all from the residential area into downtown and then Ship Creek. And if you ever want to get a sidewalk built out of line, you had trouble in the city council. Oh, you wait your turn, you get it.
There were a lot of young immigrants from Scandinavia here, and but they have big respect for women. They could go down the East End looking for their husband or something, and go into a bar, and all the cursing and noise would quiet down, and somebody would come forward and say, "Can we help you, ma'am?" I mean, that's the way it was. I saw that happen.
Wasn't the crime here then. No, you could come home at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning by yourself if you were a girl, and there was no problem of fear or anything.
And believe me, Anchorage Women's Club deserves a lot of credit for what Anchorage did and accomplished. At that time, the club took responsibility wherever it was needed. A library, to make a library go, to do anything else that really needed done, the Women's Club did. And as is true in smaller towns, outfit like that tends to be much more important than it is later when the library has a library association and people take responsibility in so many different separate areas and do it and cover it thoroughly. But the Women's Club was the one that was in there along with the Chamber of Commerce, really making Anchorage a city in the beginning. The other thing I like to give some credit to is PTA. And through the years, I think that PTA is a marvelous organization, and under their charter you can do almost anything that's good for a community, and we did through the years.
You really didn't need a car in Anchorage because everything was so close, and you got Anchorage extended to 9th Avenue. It was an easy walk from 9th to downtown, and so a lot of people didn't have cars for various reasons. Maybe they couldn't afford them, and it was not uncommon for people to walk up to Government Hill on a Saturday night for maybe a sociable card game. And also the Government Hill people to walk over to Anchorage.
And when spring came and the streets were thawing, you couldn't drive a car. You'd go down your hubs in mud and muck, and being nothing but trouble. We had a lot of horses still in use, but we had a lot of trucks showing up and doing the delivering. We had Dirty Face Porter had a contract to plow all the sidewalks with his team of horses with a A-frame plow pulling it around, and he plowed all the sidewalks before work every day. And we didn't try to plow streets. Nobody used their cars in the winter. You walked, and that's the way we lived.
We had a horrible blizzard, the worst I think Anchorage ever had, and it was in March, early March, and went on for 3 days. And it built up snowdrifts. A real strong wind blew roofs off of houses, and snow just piling real hard drifts as high as 20 feet high. Right in the middle of the road, right like 4th Avenue. You couldn't get down it because there was just this big, huge snowdrifts. They had horses with sleds out there, but even they couldn't get over those drifts.
So under those circumstances, you would not survive if you got outside of the immediate area. You get too far out, nobody would come to your place of business.
They would try to have a so-called social season. I mean, the different fraternal orders that they had in town. That was a big thing in those days. The Moose, the Elks, the Legion, the Odd Fellows, the Shriners. They all had good attendance and membership. Most of the men in town belonged to almost all of them, and then they would organize dances. And the principal place they held them was at the Elks Hall, and secondary at the Masonic Lodge.
Well, we had the ski jump in the 30s, and it was below the Alaska Native Service Hospital, built on the hill there. And they also had an ice pond down there that we could skate. And we'd have a big bonfire down there at night. It was very, very cold. And there was one street light, I believe, that lit up the area for us. And the skating rink was a busy place. That was at 6th and C Street. And Grover Fireover, he's the one that started the first skating rink for us in Anchorage. And it was quite a gathering place.
Yeah, they had this block that stretched from F Street to G Street on 4th Street, and was on the north side. And they had 3 federal buildings, small buildings, 3 green federal buildings, and from the G Street end was the post office, and then in the middle was the T&T building, they called it, the Telegraph and Telephone, which was the connection to the states by wireless, and then the U.S. Marshal's office. And it was surrounded by a lot of ground. It had a lawn out in front and gardening areas along the sides and in the rear. In fact, in the back, way in the back, they had a half a block of potato fields. And it was a pretty loosely run affair. I mean, these prisoners would go out there and garden in the summertime and raise their own potatoes and strawberries and raspberries, and do odd jobs around the jail there. And in the wintertime, lots of times my dad gave him enough money to go down to the movie theater. And there was never any. If there was a hardened criminal or somebody that committed a real violent crime like a murder, he was pretty well tried and sent on his way outside McNeil Island and Puget Sound, federal penitentiary. But for short-termers, they kept them here, but there were never very many of them.
These prisoners would keep pulling the planks off the floor. They were so rotten they could pull them up and break them out and escape. They were constantly bringing them back. Well, 1937, we got the federal building built, and that was the first, Uncle Sam's first concrete structure here. The Chamber of Commerce had that on the list of their projects for 20 years, been beating the drums for a federal building.
Well, that's an interesting story how that was built. Jim Farley, who was Postmaster General, was up touring the territory, and the local Chamber of Commerce said they wanted a picture of him.
And I'm driving. I said, would you mind taking a little detour over here? We'd like to have you break ground for a building over here. He said, okay, we can do that.
And they got him in where the federal building is, and handed him a shovel, and they took a picture of him turning the first shovel full of dirt for the new post office building.
Just cooperatives all get out, and he's standing there and he said, Bob, what building are we going to build here? I said, I'll tell you about it later. And he wanted to know more about it, and I filled him full of it on the way to the depot. And then he went back. I don't know what he did, but the federal building was built in the next year or so. Had it underway.
Oh, it was the heart and soul of downtown Anchorage. The 2 banks and the federal building is what tied things together. And that's where almost all the activity went on.
We didn't have mail delivery then, so you had to go to the post office to get your mail. So that was a daily, once or twice jaunt down to the boxes down there to get your mail. And sort of a central meeting place.
It was always kind of manufactured an excuse to go there because I knew I'd find somebody that would be somebody to talk to and visit, and could have a good conversational time.
When the legislature was meeting at times, why people would get on the post office steps and they would campaign for the legislature to pass this item or to pass that item or some other item.